Tilea's Troubles, Part 24. What to do with caution on a still day. A battle report. Very late autumn, 2401, near Astiano, in central Tilea. As evening fell, all was quiet in the peaceful hamlet of Farina, a simple cluster of houses, little bigger than an inn, which lay 2 miles northeast of the town of Astiano. Its inhabitants had had their fair share of troubles of late, what with Duke Guidobaldo of Pavonan's recent conquest of Astiano and the inevitable looting by scavenging bands of soldiers. Now they had learned that the infamous Compagnia del Sole, reputedly the largest free company active in Tilea, were outside Astiano's walls. Happily, the mercenaries seemed keener to extract a ransom from the town's citizens than to threaten the surrounding land. Perhaps the soldiers were afraid to disperse too widely. Whatever the reason, if the Council of Astiano chose to pay promptly, the people of Farina dared to hope that they might, this time, remain relatively undisturbed. The Astianans were indeed willing to raise the necessary monies, but their new overlord, Duke Guidobaldo, was moving quickly. He had been riding at the head of his army, hoping to catch the Compagnia del Sole before they could do too much of what mercenaries were famous for doing, looting and burning. He had already failed to prevent their destructive raid on his newly built settlement of Vernafro, which sat astride the road joining his old realm with the conquered town, and he had no intention of allowing the robbers to rob even more from Astiano. His desire to drive off the mercenary invaders did not bode well for Farina's future. Upon the approach of an outnumbering foe, another mercenary company would most likely have retreated, and fast. The Condottiere general, Micheletto Fortebraccio, and his officers had no intention of doing so, however, for their baggage train, overflowing with stolen goods, was not capable of sufficiently speedy movement, and they were loath to lose it. Every officer agreed that the loot took precedence, and the fact that they were on the verge of being made even richer by the terrified populace of Astiano simply increased their greed. When the Compagnia's council of war considered the matter of their reputation, they were not overly worried concerning what would become of it should they turn tail and flee, but instead were encouraged by the fact that it was surely good enough to make the Pavonans think twice before committing to battle. Had not the Duke of Pavona spent the last 6 weeks hesitantly probing and manoeuvring, attempting to scare them off without needing to meet them on the field? His actions had hardly been that of a confident general. So it was that the Compagnia, sensibly concentrated in one camp for just such a turn of events, marched boldly towards the advancing Pavonans. They did not intend to fight defensively with Astiano at their rear. Instead, they would attack, and in doing so, hopefully fuel the Duke of Pavona's doubts. Upon learning of the approach of 2 armies, the people of Farina wisely and hastily fled their houses, taking only their most precious and easily carried belongings. With them gone, the settlement fell very quiet. Then, from both east and west simultaneously, came sounds of drums and horns and shouting. The 2 armies approached, each already arraying themselves from line of march to line of battle. Captain Brizio Scarpa led the Compagnia's mounted men-at-arms on their far right flank, advancing over the low hill towards Farina. Every man wore full-plate armour and rode a steel-barded horse, and all but Scarpa carried a yellow and white striped lance, lending the regiment a pleasantly pretty appearance. General Fortebraccio had instructed the heavy horsemen to chase off whatever was out there, then turned to attack the enemy's bulk on their flank, just as they became engaged against his own massed foot regiments to their fore. Upon the other side of Farina, on the flatter, less woody ground, came the Compagnia's main strength. The gunners hauled the company's 2 artillery pieces onto the last of the little hills, which was conveniently flat-topped, as if it had been carved into a gun bastion in some past conflict. While below them, the foot-slogging men-at-arms and the regiment of halberdiers marched in line and in step. General Fortebraccio commanded the halberdiers, accompanied by his old friend, the standard-bearer, Van Halt, while the men-at-arms, the most veteran soldiers in the company, bar their mounted equivalents, were commanded by the white-haired Captain Gaetano. Out on the far left flank, a large company of crossbowmen rushed forwards to plant their protective pervasers and began the skilled business of preparing and spanning their crossbows. While these three large bodies of foot arrayed in line, the Pavonans came on in a not dissimilar array. Mirroring the mercenaries, they planted one of their own artillery pieces on a hill, upon the other side of Farina, while their horse soldiers were arrayed on their line's left flank, with Duke Guidobaldo and his eldest son Lord Polcario personally commanding them. A large body of handgunners came up on the right, with a deadly-looking engine on the farthest flank. Desiring that his forces not only be drilled but also equipped in a modern and imperial manner, Duke Guidobaldo had acquired the multi-barrelled novelty from Nuln. General Fortebraccio was thankful that he had not attempted to outflank the enemy upon that side, for heavily armoured horse would surely fare badly against such a mass of shot. The Pavonans' main foot regiments were in the centre, with the regiment of swordsmen to the left of the handgunners, then a small company of archers, then their 2 regiments of halberdiers. Between the massed foot and the horse, General Fortebraccio was surprised to see yet another body of handgunners. This preponderance of gunpowder weapons was further proof of Duke Guidobaldo's urge to command a most modern army. The Pavonans' line easily overlapped the Compagnia's, for they had nearly twice the number of regiments of foot, 2 of which also possessed sizable detachments, although in balance the Compagnia's individual regiments were substantially larger. Despite the disparity in numbers, the Compagnia del Sole's light horse, a small body of crossbowmen mounted upon horses little better than nags, rushed to the far flank in an attempt to match the foe's line, which meant they would face a much larger body of pistoliers on the enemy's far left, who were already trotting boldly forwards besides the hamlet. General Micheletto Fortebraccio surveyed the enemy, noting their numbers, their arms, their deployment. The Pavonans' blue and white banners fluttered prettily above the glittering steel of their helmets and halberd blades. One thing that caught his eye immediately was their uniformity, in their livery, but also in the steady ease of their advance, the neatness of their rank and files. This was certainly no hurriedly mustered force of ill-trained militia, but soldiers practised in drill and apparently sure of themselves. Their leader, Duke Guidobaldo, famously claimed to be the most favoured of the god Moor. Could it be that his soldiers were similarly emboldened, even disciplined, by religious fervour? General Fortebraccio now wondered if he and his officers had been very wrong about the Duke's reluctance to commit to battle. Not wanting his new concerns to show, he turned to address Van Halt, the black-bearded and wild-eyed northerner who carried the halberdiers' magically imbued standard. "What do you think of the foe, brave Ban? Are they the blessed servants of a god?" Van Halt grinned. "Well, they dress well enough. 'Twill be a shame to besmear such pretty clothes with blood." Fortebraccio expected nothing less than such bravado from the ensign. Many other men were within earshot, and Van Halt would know what they needed to hear. Pondering aloud whether or not the enemy were watched over by the god of death was perhaps not the best conversation to have right now. Taking the ensign's lead, the general laughed. Then, spotting the movement of wagons behind the enemy's lines, he declared, "Oh, look, brave Ban, they brought even more baggage. At this rate we're going to have too much to carry." What happened next was not at all what the general expected. Rather than advance in line, to bring all their strength to bear as one, the Pavonan handgunners and archers moved ahead, while the main fighting unit stayed put. In doing so, their missile troops blocked their heavy horses' line of advance. Maybe the foe was not as confident as he had feared. Could it be that they planned to fight this battle from a distance, with ball and arrow, too afraid to engage in the melee? Or was it that they knew something he did not? It now dawned on him that the Pavonans might have more units moving up on the Compagnia's right, obscured by the hamlet, trees and hills, with which they intended to outflank the Compagnia and gain the advantage, just as he had thought his own heavy horse might do. If so, they would want to buy time, which would explain their current manoeuvres. All he could do, however, was hope Captain Scarpa would deal with whatever was on the right, or if not, that the captain would find a way to warn him about it. What exactly did the enemy have upon that flank? In actuality, it was the Pistoliers, who advanced confidently over the hilly ground to the west of the hamlet. Each was furnished with a brace of pistols, and at least a cuirass and tassets, although some were plated from crown to knee in metal. Their mastery of horsemanship was obvious, as they came on in close order, despite the rough ground. Captain Brizio Scarpa, commanding the Compagnia's heavy horse, quickly realised he could not simply choose to ignore the Pistoliers and continue his attempt to outflank the enemy's main line. To do so would most certainly leave the enemy free to wreak havoc at the Compagnia's rear, perhaps attacking the artillery crews on the hill, or even capturing the precious baggage train. And so, reluctantly, he ordered his regiment to turn and face them. His heart sank as he did so, for he knew full well how difficult it could be for a body of heavily armoured riders such as his own to get to grips with such a slippery opponent. Light horsemen could perform a nimble dance when they had to. As his men turned, the enemy unleashed a loud volley of pistol shots at the Compagnia's mounted crossbowmen. Unsurprisingly, several of the Compagnia soldiers fell as a consequence, leaving only one pair alive. These two, stunned and entirely unsure of themselves, nevertheless remained before the foe. Scarpa noted all this as his men reformed. What he did not notice was the enemy cannon upon the hill upon the other side of the hamlet. The men crewing that cannon were more observant, however, and spotted sunlight glinting off the mount's steel carapaces as they turned into position. Grinning, the gunners hefted their piece around to aim its muzzle through a gap between the buildings, directly at the horsemen's rear rank. The ball whizzed through the hamlet of Farina to decapitate two of the riders, much to the confusion of the rest, who heard the guns blast only the briefest moment before the awful thud-thud of their comrades' demise. Keen to vacate their current position, they spurred their horses on to attack the rear of the Pistoliers, who had, while Scarpa's men had been distracted by the round shot, cut down the last two crossbowmen. When the Pavonan Pistoliers realised the heavy horsemen were about to close on them, all show of bravery dissipated, and they fled away, pell-mell, not to return to the battle. The mounted men-at-arms let loose a hurrah, and under Captain Scarpa's orders began the business of reforming, so that they could go about their original intentions. Captain Scarpa prayed that they were not too late. Compagnia del Sole's maroon flags fluttered in the blustery wind as their two main bodies of foot soldiers awaited orders. Already a cannon shot had killed an entire file of halberdiers, and along the whole line there had been a scattering of injuries received from smaller missiles. Their own cannons and crossbows had felled a few of the enemy's knights, as well as some handgunners, but the Pavonans seemed unshaken. What magical duels there were between the wizards had proved unspectacular. General Fortebraccio was growing worried. Captain Scarpa and the heavy horse should have made their appearance by now, yet there was no sight of them. A little while ago he had heard the sound of a volley of firearms from beyond the hamlet, either pistols or handguns. He could not be sure. Since then, nothing. If the horsemen did not come upon the flank, it would leave his two regiments facing 3 enemy regiments of foot and a regiment of heavy horse. The enemy line would extend far beyond his own, allowing them to overlap, flank, and so engulf the Compagnia foot. Fine soldiers, as General Fortebraccio's men were, it was not likely they would stand their ground if attacked on both sides while simultaneously pressed to the front. He needed Scarpa's riders. Not a man to delay when a decision was needed, the general glanced over at Captain Gaetano, on the front and left of the foot men-at-arms to his right. Gaetano's white hair was blowing wildly, while his heavy blade was held before him, shining sharply. General Fortebraccio knew the old soldier would follow his command without question, and already, even before he had fully formed his intention, a pang of guilt played through him. He was damned if he was going to lose the plunder they had already taken, and doubly damned if he would risk the Compagnia's complete annihilation to boot. It was time to leave, while there was still a chance of taking the loot with them. Not later, not soon, but right now. And Gaetano's men-at-arms could hinder the enemy's inevitable pursuit. The guilt Fortebraccio had felt before now surged, not because he was going to ask Gaetano to fight, nor even because it was a fight the captain would surely lose, but rather because he would have to lie to his old companion, and cruelly too. He could not reveal he was sending Gaetano and the men-at-arms to their death, simply so that he could abandon the field and save his own skin. And so he had to order the advance in such a way that Gaetano and his men did not realise what was truly intended. In a sense, it was a lie only by omission, but that did not make the general feel any better. He commanded the drummer by his side to beat up a right-hand advance oblique, a manoeuvre the Compagnia had practised on several occasions. The rightmost unit would march on, the next waiting a moment before doing so, resulting in a staggered arrival at the foe's line of battle, hopefully allowing the second and subsequent units time to respond to the enemy's actions and so better protect the flank of the first unit. Except now, after the order was given and the men-at-arms moved on, General Fortebraccio held up his hand to order his own regiment to halt. And so they stood, watching the other regiment march out alone. Having already lost 5 men to the enemy's magic and 7 more to a well-placed cannonball, the halberdiers were sufficiently stunned enough not to question the order. The men-at-arms advance turned into something of a charge at the little body of handgunners ahead of them. They did not reach the foe, as the handgunners fled away through their own knights. Van Halt, the ensign, frowned, then revealed his confusion to General Fortebraccio by asking, "We're not advancing?" General Fortebraccio stood, silent, watching, his hand held aloft. His guilt welled to unbearable levels, mixed with anxiety and regret. All his men were hardened mercenaries, his men-at-arms skilled warriors clad in plate steel, his halberdiers emboldened in any fight by the magical aura of their blessed banner. They could fight, and fight well. He looked again at the enemy. Yes, they had more bodies of men, but those bodies were smaller than his, even after all the damage his halberdiers had received, and they were not so well armoured. Had he been foolish? Nevertheless, he now found himself signalling to his halberdiers to fall back, facing the foe in good order. As the drum beat the command, he heard Van Halt repeat his words of before, but this time said with bitterness, "We're not advancing." Just then, Fortebraccio spotted something between the trees and the hamlet, something yellow and white. Lancers! It was Scarpa and his heavy horsemen. The general had to stop himself from crying no. His thoughts were half prayer, half anguished. "Myrmidia, forgive me. What have I done?" Van Halt sniffed, a mundane sort of sound that would well suit the task of gaining a fellow's attention on a lazy summer's evening in an alehouse. General Fortebraccio looked at him. Raising his eyebrows, bitterness in his eyes, Van Halt announced, "We should have advanced." Captain Gaetano and his men-at-arms had apparently not yet noticed the general's deception, for they marched boldly on. Some even let out a cheer when they spotted their own heavy horsemen on the flank. Captain Scarpa could see something was wrong, and halted his horsemen, if only to work out what was happening. He watched as the men-at-arms were charged by not 1, not 2, but 3 enemy regiments, halberdiers and horse. The foot soldiers received the charge defiantly, barely budging an inch, and after taking some casualties from the foe's first thrusts, they brought down their own heavy blades, polearms and hammers to return the favour. Captain Scarpa knew this should have been the moment he and his company joined the fray. But where were the others? Had the enemy somehow broken the general's large regiment of halberdiers, with magic and missiles? Scrutinising the field, he spotted General Fortebraccio and most of the halberdiers. They were still present, just not where they should be. Worse than that, they were, albeit slowly, falling back. Then, just as the melee in the centre of the field became a furious, clattering mess of screams and blood, the halberdiers turned and began a much more vigorous march away. Clearly the battle was lost. Captain Scarpa now realised General Fortebraccio must have already decided it was over some time ago, and was in the process of ensuring that neither the Compagnia nor the loot was also lost. Scarpa vented a cry of anguish. If only the general had had more trust in him and his riders. Yet still, he knew there was no point in staying now, and ordered his men to wheel around and gallop away. A handful of crossbowmen and the gunners also moved away, the former hastily, the latter as quickly as they dare, considering they were dragging guns down a slope. It was almost, but not quite, disorderly. As General Fortebraccio approached the baggage train, he urged them on as best they could, ensuring the loot left with him. Behind, the foot men-at-arms, with no real chance to escape, fought almost to the last, with only a handful trying, and failing, to escape. It was not the Compagnia del Sole's finest moment. Yet, however diminished in strength, the company had survived, along with their plunder. And that, thought General Fortebraccio, was what mattered most. Hopefully, the rest of his officers would agree.